Imagine a coastline where ocean waves have beaten against stone for thousands of years, where fog doesn't lift for months at a time, where people were building stone houses when the Egyptians were only beginning to raise their pyramids. This is not legend. This is Skara Brae on the Orkney Islands, a settlement over 5,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is the story of a country that no empire could fully subdue. A country whose thinkers transformed the global economy, whose engineers ignited the Industrial Revolution, and whose soldiers shed blood on every continent under another nation's flag. And yet, a country that still seeks the answer to one question: who does it want to be? This is Scotland. Scotland occupies the northern third of the island of Great Britain. It divides naturally into three zones: the highlands in the north and west, coastlines carved by sea locks and granite summits, the lowlands at the centre, the most populated and economically developed belt, and the archipelagos, the Orkney, Shetland and Hebridean Islands, each with its own distinct cultural identity. The word Scotland simply means land of the Scots. But who were the Scots? The name was given by the Romans to the Gaelic peoples who inhabited both modern Scotland and Ireland. Interestingly, in Old English the word Scotland originally referred to Ireland, because that was where the Gaels lived. Only by the 11th century did the name firmly attach itself to the lands north of the River Forth. The Gaels themselves called their land Alba, a name that survives to this day in poetic tradition. The Romans, unable to subdue the northern tribes, called their lands Caledonia, after the tribal confederation of the Caledonians. That romantic name became a synonym for Scotland for many centuries to come. People arrived in these lands around 13,000 years ago, immediately after the retreat of the ice sheet that had covered the island during the last glacial maximum. The first inhabitants were hunter-gatherers, following herds of animals through a newly opened tundra. By 3500 BC, stone houses already stood on the Orkney Islands. Skara Brae consists of 9 homes connected by underground passageways, with built-in stone furniture, beds, shelves, and storage niches. Its inhabitants abandoned it around 2500 BC for reasons still not fully understood. Why are so many Neolithic monuments so well preserved here? The answer is simple. On the Orkney and Shetland Islands there were almost no trees, so builders used stone, a material that endures for millennia. From roughly 600 to 500 BC, Celtic peoples became the dominant force across the British Isles. The question of their origin remains a matter of scholarly debate. The traditional theory holds they migrated from Central Europe during the Bronze Age. A newer hypothesis suggests Celtic culture and language developed along the Atlantic coasts of the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles. Regardless of their point of origin, it was the Celtic heritage that set Scotland apart from England and shaped its character for millennia. Celtic languages survive to this day in the form of Welsh, Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic. In 43 AD, Roman legions landed in southern Britain, and within decades had subdued most of the island. But north of the River Forth they met a wall, not of stone but of people. The local tribes, collectively called Picts by the Romans, mounted such fierce resistance that no stable administration was ever established there. In 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall between the rivers Tyne and Solway, a massive fortification 117 kilometres long, lined with towers and forts. Its purpose was straightforward: to protect the civilized province from raids from the north. His successor Antoninus Pius pushed further. In 142 AD, the Antonine Wall was built between the rivers Clyde and Forth, turf-built, 63 kilometres long. This was the northernmost point at which Rome ever attempted to establish stable governance anywhere in its entire empire. Yet within a decade the wall was abandoned, too costly, too remote, too dangerous. The legions withdrew to Hadrian's Wall, which was maintained until the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. With Rome's departure, Britain entered the era historians call the Dark Ages, not because there was no light, but because written sources have barely survived. On the territory of modern Scotland, processes unfolded that would define its future for centuries. We know the Picts, the indigenous inhabitants of Scotland, primarily through their art, enigmatic carved stones bearing symbols still not fully deciphered. Their language vanished without trace, displaced by Irish Gaelic brought by Gaelic settlers, who crossed from Eastern Ireland from the 3rd to the 5th centuries. Meanwhile, the Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon kingdom pushed northward as far as Edinburgh. From the west, Gaelic settlers from Ireland founded the kingdom of Dalriata. In this way, Scotland of the 7th and 8th centuries was a mosaic of at least 4 distinct peoples and cultures, competing, warring, and intermingling. At the end of the 8th century, longships emerged from Norwegian fjords. For the monasteries of Orkney and the Hebrides, it was catastrophe. In 795 AD, Vikings sacked the monastery on the island of Iona, founded by St. Columba, the very symbol of Celtic Christianity. But the Vikings did not come only to plunder. They settled, mixed with local populations, and left a deep mark on place names. Hundreds of towns and headlands in northern Scotland bear names of Scandinavian origin. The Orkney and Shetland Islands remained under Norwegian rule until 1472, 5 centuries after the Viking Age began. It was the Viking threat that accelerated unification. Around 843 AD, Kenneth MacAlpin, King of the Gaels, united the Gaelic and Pictish lands under a single crown, laying the foundation for what would become the Kingdom of Scotland. All subsequent Scottish monarchs traced their lineage to him. Under this centralised authority, the first towns began to form, farming methods were refined, and the identity we today recognise as Scottish began to take shape. 1066 changed everything across the British Isles. After the Norman conquest of England, Franco-Norman culture began seeping northward, through the royal court, through intermarriage, through trade. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Scottish monarchs invited Norman knights and merchants into their burghs, chartered towns. In these urban centres, Middle English, itself a blend of Old English and French, took root in the urban environment and gave birth to the Scots language, an independent language in its own right, not merely a dialect. The largest of these burghs, founded on a narrow rocky ridge overlooking the sea, would become the capital of the nation. By the 14th century, Edinburgh was already recorded as Scotland's principal city. Scottish King Alexander III is killed when his horse stumbles off a cliff on a stormy night on the Fife coast. His death leaves the throne without a direct heir. English King Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks, exploited the crisis masterfully. He offered himself as arbitrator among 13 claimants to the crown, demanding in return acknowledgement of England's suzerainty over Scotland. John Balliol received the throne, but soon refused to participate in Edward's French wars. The response was brutal. Edward deposed Balliol, removed from Scone the Stone of Destiny, the symbol of Scottish kingship, and carried it to London, where it would remain for 700 years until its return to Edinburgh Castle in 1996. From this humiliation, resistance was born. William Wallace, a knight of modest rank, united the Scots, and in 1297 crushed the English at Stirling Bridge. A smaller army destroyed a larger one by exploiting a narrow river crossing. But in 1305, Wallace was captured and publicly executed in London, with theatrical brutality as a warning to the rest. The flame did not die. Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland in 1306, and over 8 years of guerrilla warfare gradually reclaimed the country. The culmination came at the Battle of Bannockburn on 23rd to 24th of June 1314. A Scottish army of roughly 6,000 to 7,000 men met an English force of over 15,000, and won, by choosing boggy ground where the advantage of heavy cavalry was neutralised. This victory did not merely halt the English advance, it secured Scotland's independence for 3.5 centuries. The following 2 centuries between Scotland and England were neither peace nor full-scale war. The borderlands lived by their own rules. Reivers, armed bands, raided from both sides, sometimes with their government's tacit approval, sometimes simply out of opportunity. The word reiver itself gave the English language the verb bereave. Within Scotland itself, the gulf between highlands and lowlands widened. The Highland clans lived by a system of loyalty to a chief, the clan. This shaped not merely social structure but an entire worldview. Honour, revenge, alliances and betrayals were daily realities. Highlanders contemptuously called the lowland Scots Sassenachs, Saxons, viewing them as simply a variety of Englishmen. Lowland townsfolk in turn looked upon Highlanders as savage and uncivilised. This internal division would cost Scotland dearly in the century to come. The 16th century brought Scotland both reformation and tragedy. The Protestant Revolution, inspired by John Knox, overturned the country's religious life. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament adopted a Protestant confession of faith and broke with Rome. The new Scottish Church, Presbyterian, placed scripture and conscience above any earthly authority. The consequences would be far-reaching. Against this backdrop ruled Mary Stuart, a fervent Catholic, raised at the French court, outwardly refined yet inwardly contradictory. Her reign was a succession of catastrophes: suspicion of involvement in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, a scandalous remarriage to the prime suspect, an armed uprising by her own subjects, forced abdication in 1567, and flight to England, where she spent 19 years under house arrest in Elizabeth I's castles. Elizabeth, a Protestant whom the Pope had declared illegitimate, saw in Mary a mortal threat, a Catholic claimant with the blood of Henry VII in her veins. Spymaster Walsingham entrapped her, and on February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Her infant son James remained, the future architect of the union of two crowns. James VI of Scotland had ruled for 36 years when fate smiled on him unexpectedly. Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March 1603, leaving no heir. The closest claimant to the English throne was James himself, and he became James I of England. Two crowns rested on one head, yet the two countries remained separate states with their own parliaments, laws and churches. This was a personal union, not a merger. The 1690s brought the coldest decade Scotland had experienced in 750 years. Harvests failed for several consecutive seasons. By various estimates, between 10 and 15% of the population died of famine, the 7 lean years, Scotland's demographic catastrophe. Desperation drove Scottish investors toward an audacious venture. The Darien Scheme, a plan to establish a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama, seemed brilliantly conceived. Whoever controlled the shortest passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific would control the trade routes between Europe and Asia. Around 20% of Scotland's entire capital was invested in the project. Landowners, merchants, widows, all staked everything on this gamble. But Panama proved a death trap. Tropical diseases, malaria and dysentery, cut the colonists down. The terrain was swampy. The Spanish crown, to whom these lands belonged, dispatched a fleet. Of the several thousand settlers sent in two waves in 1698 to 1700, the majority perished from disease. The project collapsed utterly, leaving the country in a pit of debt. Bankruptcy accelerated what had been debated in corridors of power for years. The Scottish elite concluded that the only path to prosperity was equal access to British trade routes and colonies. England paid off the debts. In return, in 1707, both parliaments ratified Acts of Union, and the Scottish Parliament dissolved itself. Scottish members of Parliament departed for Westminster. Great Britain was born. The poet Robert Burns later wrote of this agreement that Scotland had been bought and sold for English gold. But for the Scottish elite, the arithmetic was simple. In exchange for 292 years of closed doors came an open ocean of opportunity. The paradox: a country that had lost its own parliament became, in the following 80 years, one of the intellectual capitals of the world. In the 18th century Edinburgh, ideas bubbled and fermented. In the coffee houses of the Royal Mile, philosophers, engineers, architects and physicians debated the great questions of the age. The University of Edinburgh, founded in 1583, raised an entire generation of geniuses. Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, a treatise that laid the foundations of modern market economics and free trade. David Hume re-examined the very basis of human knowledge. James Watt perfected the steam engine. His 1769 design, featuring a separate condenser, transformed steam into a practical motive force and launched the Industrial Revolution. Without Watt, the 19th century would have looked entirely different. The Encyclopedia Britannica, whose first edition was published in Edinburgh between 1768 and 1771, became the first systematic compendium of human knowledge in the English-speaking world. Edinburgh earned the nickname Athens of the North, and deserved it. The city was being literally rebuilt. Construction of the new town began in 1767. Georgian neoclassical quarters laid out to the north of the cramped old town, wedged between Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood. This architectural ensemble is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But not everyone was celebrating. The Highlands seethed with resentment against the Union and nostalgia for the Stuart dynasty. In August 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed on the Hebridean shore with a handful of supporters. Within weeks, an army had gathered around him, Highlanders and disaffected lowlanders united by the Jacobite dream of a Stuart restoration. The first victory came quickly. In September 1745, the Jacobites crushed government forces at Prestonpans. The army marched south, reached Derby, barely 200 kilometres from London. But French support never materialised, and English Catholics did not rise. On December the 6th, 1745, Charles retreated. The reckoning came on the 16th of April, 1746, on the moorland of Culloden near Inverness. In 40 minutes, the Duke of Cumberland's government army destroyed the Jacobite force. Around 1,500 Scots were killed, almost exclusively Highlanders. Culloden was the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil, and the final breath of the old Highland Scotland. The Highland clearances followed, the forced eviction of thousands of tenants from their lands, the destruction of the clan system through legislation in 1746 to 1747, the prohibition of tartan and the bagpipe. Highlanders became shepherds on other men's land, or emigrants. The 19th century belonged to Glasgow. The city on the River Clyde became the forge of empire. Its shipyards produced vessels that sailed every ocean. The Cutty Sark, one of the fastest sailing ships of the 19th century, built at Dumbarton in 1869. The Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the largest ocean liners of their time. HMS Hood, the largest warship in the world at the time of its launch in 1918, sunk by the Bismarck in 1941 with the loss of 1,415 of its 1,418 crew. But behind the industrial brilliance lay darkness. Late 19th century Glasgow had the worst slums in Great Britain, and possibly in all of Europe. Thousands of families crowded into single rooms. Child mortality in some districts exceeded 50%. Between 1841 and 1931, between 2 and 2.5 million Scots emigrated to North America, Australia and New Zealand. Another million relocated to England. Scotland gave the British Empire a disproportionate share of its leaders. 7 British Prime Ministers were born in Scotland. Scottish regiments, the Black Watch, the Gordon Highlanders, the Scots Guards, fought on every continent. Field Marshal Douglas Haig commanded the British armies in the First World War. Under his command came the Battle of the Somme in 1916, one of the bloodiest in human history. On the first day alone, July 1st, 1916, around 57,000 British soldiers were killed. His critics named him Butcher Haig. In the Second World War, Scotland's extensive coastline and shipbuilding industry once again proved strategically decisive. Today, on the River Clyde at Faslane, Britain's submarine nuclear fleet is based, a permanent source of tension between London and Edinburgh. The second half of the 20th century brought deindustrialisation. Coal mines were exhausted, shipbuilding declined under pressure from Asian competition, mass redundancies and strikes convulsed the 1970s. But in that same decade, oil was discovered in the North Sea, and this overturned the entire independence debate. If Scotland is rich in its own resources, why share them with London? The Scottish National Party gathered strength. In 1997, a referendum approved the restoration of a Scottish Parliament. On July 1st, 1999, after a 292-year hiatus, Parliament resumed its work at Holyrood. But for many this was not enough. In 2014, a referendum on full independence was held. No, 55.3%. Yes, 44.7%. The question was not resolved. 5,450,000 people live in Scotland today, in a country where per capita there are more languages, more ales, more wind, and more arguments about the future than anywhere else on the British Isles. It is simultaneously ancient and restlessly alive. In the language of Robert Burns and Walter Scott, in Gaelic and in Scots, in contemporary Glasgow slang and parliamentary debate at Holyrood, it continues its conversation with the world.